Leisa, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be here.
I've followed your work for years. We've had a conversation for the podcast before. So excited to dive in. And today, what I thought would be really good for people is to learn from you around what not to do when telling stories. And we often hear, oh, these are the things you should do, but what should we not do? And why don't we start off? I'd love it if you told people a little bit more about why stories are so important to you, and then dive into a common mistake that people make when they're telling their story.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So, I discovered, I guess, when I was starting my business and I was starting a coaching business, that a lot of coaches were not very good at talking about what they do, and they didn't tell a story. They essentially said what everybody said, which is, I'm a career coach or I'm a life coach or whatever it was, and it left me feeling like, oh, another one. It's kind of there was nothing there, and what had happened for me prior to that was that I came out of a learning and development career in organizations, and I'd been in the classroom doing training, and I'd found myself telling stories just as a thing that I did naturally. But I'd noticed that when I told stories, people would go from being disengaged to being riveted, just to being really, really connected and really engaged. And it completely changed the way I trained. So that from, sometimes in an organization, you train stuff that you don't necessarily choose. Some of it's compliance, and there's all kinds of reasons you do training. But what I found was when I told stories, people listened, they got into the discussion, and they retained the information more. And so when I started my business and I noticed that so many coaches and so many business owners were really struggling to get clients because they were just struggling to talk about what they did in a way that sounded compelling, I knew that story could be the answer. And that's when I set off trying to figure out, okay, what are the kinds of stories? What are the kinds of stories we need to be able to sell? What are the kind of stories we need to engage? And I began to explore that whole world. And, fast forward about I mean, more than a decade, that's what I do is I help organizations, businesses, and entrepreneurs and people in general to really feel comfortable telling a story that is compelling and that is interesting to others so that they get, whether it's the business they want or the kind of enrollment in the ideas that they have or the support, or just to be able to feel confident that they're telling a story that's interesting and that people will remember. Now, they don't may not necessarily remember the story, but they'll remember you and they'll remember the way you made them feel because of the story you told. It's very, very powerful. And what happens with story is that when we tell a compelling story and we tell a relevant story, people instinctively trust us and trust what we're doing. And that, trust is one of the most valuable commodities in business. When you can instill trust in others, when people feel that you are real and authentic and trustworthy, then they will invest in whatever your program or service is. So again, very, very powerful for business.
And that's beautiful. And what's a common mistake that people make?
Yeah, so I think a common mistake people make is they think, well, I just have to find my one story. Like there's one story, and that's the story I have to find. And people talk about their signature story, and I just don't really believe that we can essentially condense our entire life's experience into one story that says it all. I just don't think it's possible. I think our lives are too interesting. Day to day, we have, stories are going on all the time. And so I'm much more interested in the idea that we can understand how stories work and we can understand how to find the stories and craft them and tell them in a way that's powerful so that we are not limited by one single story. Because when you have one single story, people get tired of it and it may not impact everybody and it may not be right for the same, for different activities in your business. So you need many stories. And you need to know how to find the right story for the right audience at the right time and in the right format. And then you get the outcomes that are just, it will explode your business.
One of the things that I think I've always been concerned about in telling my story is oversharing or
Mm,
including maybe too many details, then
Mm.
it loses people's attention, or they might feel sorry for me. And that's not the intention. But I'm curious about, is that
Yeah.
something people do incorrectly?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And they're two slightly different things. So oversharing and adding too many details, they're two quite separate things and very distinctive and very important to think about and to think about how not to do it. So oversharing is a situation where lots of people are saying, oh, you have to be vulnerable. You have to be vulnerable. That's the key, be vulnerable. And I really don't believe in being vulnerable for the sake of being vulnerable. I believe in telling a story that means something to you, but more importantly, is appropriate for the audience. And the idea is that we are in service of our audience when we tell these stories. So it's not about telling the story that I need to tell because that's how I process this, incredibly traumatic experience. No, that's a story. Yes, you might need to tell it, but to your therapist or to your partner or to your friend. You don't need to tell it in a business context. Now, I always say that all stories should be told, just not always in your business. And so if the story feels in any way too vulnerable, if it feels like it's not resolved fully, if it feels like it's very emotional, then it's probably a story that's not ready to tell because it's not going to be of service to the audience. It's still going to be doing its work on you. And that leaves us in a situation where we end up sharing the wrong things, or we end up sharing in a way that's just inappropriate. The story that's going to impact the audience is the one that serves the audience. It's the one that's relevant to the audience. And hopefully it's something that means something is important to you too. So there will be a little bit of vulnerability, but it won't be to the point where you leave an audience uncomfortable. We never want to do that. Yeah. So for
Yeah.
example, you might have had a horrible failure in your business, like something, and that happened to me where I did a launch and it just completely failed. It was a disaster. And I didn't, initially I felt ashamed, I felt stupid, like all the things we feel when we go through failure. And I remember a colleague reached out and she said to me, she had no idea what had happened. She said to me, so how was the launch? And I said, well, and I kind of took a deep breath, and part of me wanted to lie. I wanted to say, oh yeah, it was great, and brush over. And I just said, well, actually, it was terrible. And she said, oh, really? What happened? And I told her what happened. And she said, oh, listen, it happens to all of us. Let's take some time and go through it and figure out what you can do differently next time. So it was amazing for me to hear that. But going forward, as I had more successes in the business, the question was, well, do I pull out that massive failure and share it? And the answer was absolutely yes, because everybody has failure. And while it feels awful, we need to be able to, the lesson is we learn from it. And part of my learning was actually colleagues can be of great support and I don't have to pretend. And by sharing the fact that I failed, it actually endears me to more people who feel like, okay, if I fail, she'll understand, or if I fail, she can help. Right.
Yeah, it's so cool to hear you say that. And I also know how hard it is because I recently shared some things that I had been thinking about for 10 years and wanting to share, but not really knowing how, and not really knowing like whose feet might I step on, or who might I offend, or because I was taking a very strong opinion of something and I
Mm.
was worried about that. And this video is close to like 100,000 views, and I'm cracking up because I guess it did what you're talking about, like I shared those things, but I'm on the other side of them. I'm not, giving, it's funny, when I first recorded the video, I actually was really emotional. And then I thought, that's not going to help anybody. It was like cathartic or something.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I'm like, I'm going to do this again. And the second video
Yeah.
was completely different because I had processed through everything. And now it was about the listener and viewer
Yeah.
versus about me. So,
And that's
totally.
exactly it. That's the rule of thumb, which is make it about, when you are doing something in service of the audience, in something that's going to be relevant to the audience. And if it's emotional, that's okay. And if it's hard to share, that's okay. And if you feel a little vulnerable, that's okay, as long as you're not doing it in order for, as you said, to kind of process it or whatever. And the other issue that you mentioned that I think is also an important mistake to try and avoid is like adding too many details. And what happens is that we are super like committed to everything we remember in an incident, like because we feel like, oh my God, it's our life. We were there, we saw it, we remember, it's like when when you might put in a resume for a job and you want to put in everything you've ever done, but the reality is what's relevant to the job is the only thing you need to have in that resume. But it's really hard for us to like take out the experience we had here or the years we spent there because that was our life. And we feel like somehow we're abandoning our experience or our commitment. And with story, what happens is you have to really look at the story and think, well, literally on a word to word basis, does this serve the purpose, the intention of this story? Does this detail, is it really serving the narrative here, or is it just an added detail because I remember it, and I always think with story that less is more. So you have to pare it down so that every word counts and every word matters, and anything that's superfluous, we can just let it go. It's not going to do anything to our memory by letting it go. It's not going to do anything to our feeling of like, am I telling the truth or am I telling it all? We don't need to tell it all. We just need to tell the piece that's relevant and in service. That's really what we need to do.
Mm. When we've watched a lot of videos or we've listened to a lot of people's stories, there seems to be, for me, a moment where I think to myself, this person is really authentic. And then other times, this feels very inauthentic. Like there's just something's happening as I'm watching that story be told that I feel like I'm being played or a bit
Mm.
manipulated. And I'm curious, like, what's happening there for people?
It's a really good question. Well, I think where the authenticity comes in is where somebody shares something that it's like it's very hard to fake authenticity. We feel it. It's not something like you can't pretend to be authentic. And when you are authentic, it comes through. And so when people are just not being authentic, that comes through too. I think that's what you're sensing. And so there's something in what they're sharing that's either it's probably not emotionally honest. It may
Mm,
be practically honest. It may be that these things happened, but it may not be emotionally honest. And it may be emotionally, like, it's almost like emotionally engineered. Like, if I tell it this way, then the person's going to feel this thing. I remember some years ago hearing a very traumatic story that somebody had experienced. It was a real story, but the way she told it was so practiced and so, like, every pause you could tell had been coached, so much so that it felt like she was waiting for the audience to fall apart, and it felt incredibly manipulative. And actually, some of the audience had a very bad response to this story because it was quite a traumatic story. I think we have to hold enormous respect for our audience and try and understand how they are receiving the story. We can never know exactly how a person receives a story because you tell something and they hear something and they're rarely the same. That's just the reality. And oftentimes people will tell me their story and I'll say to them, well, here's what I've heard. I know it's not exactly what they've said, but I know it's what I've heard. And so there's always going to be that gap. But if you're telling a story with huge respect for your audience, given that there may be a range of ways in which they can actually absorb and hear the story, and knowing that you want your story to be safe for them, and manipulation is not safe. So if you come with the intention, in my mind, people whose stories feel inauthentic is firstly because they probably don't have a very great intention with the story, or
mhm,
it may not be an honest intention, or it may be a slightly manipulative intention. And secondly, they're not being honest with their experience or with their emotion, and so that's what creates that feeling you get. So essentially, it's the opposite, which is you have to have good intentions, you have to have respect for your audience, you have to be honest with your emotions. And if the emotion is not there anymore, stop telling the story. That's another
mhm.
thing that happens. People keep telling the same story for a very long time, long after it ceases to mean anything to them. And then they're telling the story that used to mean something to them, but it doesn't anymore. And either they haven't noticed or they don't care. It's like if the story no longer has meaning, stop telling it.
So powerful. This is reminding me of the whole motivational speaker sort of
Mhm.
circuit. And what I'm always looking for these authentic people. And many times, like, you can see that the story is powerful and engaging, and they've got the audience, but there's also this experience on the side where it's like it's been so rehearsed, so practiced, so perfectly timed that it's kind of like you're having two different experiences in that with that speaker. And I think that the world, maybe that worked 10 years ago, or, because I feel like there was a time and place, but consciousness has evolved. And I think that what seems to have a bigger impact for me and perhaps for listeners is when we feel like we're living it with them, like we're inside of that story. And so I'm curious about
There's, there's
that.
actually
Like,
a very simple explanation for this.
ooh,
I
okay.
that I believe. You can be super practiced with a story so that every single word is going to be said, and when to say it, and with the pausing, with everything, and it can be enormously authentic. And you can do that super practice thing and it can be awful. And the difference is being present. And the minute the person loses their presence, the audience feels it. Even if they can't explain it, they feel it. And they start feeling like, oh, it's too practiced. Oh, he's told us a million times. Like, I can honestly tell you, when I get up on stages or when I'm doing online classes or online, whatever kind of speaking I'm doing, I will rarely tell a story that I haven't told hundreds of times before, because that's my trade. I'm a professional storyteller. I know how to tell stories. I take stories, I work on them, I massage them, I change them, I work, that's how I bring stories to light. But I like to believe, and it's the feedback I get, that people feel like I had just thought of it and it's the first time I've ever told it. And the reason why is because I am fully present when I tell stories. You have to be fully present. And so when these speakers get up and they're kind of doing, it may be their third event that week and it's only a Wednesday, and they're doing the same thing they've done to an audience of 1,000 the day before, there is something that they sometimes lose presence, and sometimes you can catch the actual moment when they lose presence. It's quite interesting, like, because I study this, I see sometimes a person, and I also train in this, somebody will tell a story and then suddenly you see something happens, they get distracted, and something happens to the story. You stop believing it. You stop, like, they're not correlated, but they're completely correlated. And oftentimes I'll say to them, so what happened when you got to this part of the story? And they'll say, oh, my phone buzzed in my pocket and I was wondering who had called me, or I noticed somebody walked by the window and I wondered why they were leaving, or there was an instant of distraction or something happened where they lost focus and they lost presence. We feel it immediately. And so people who are highly practiced, and that's their profession, sometimes they forget that being fully present is a big part of how it's going to work in the delivery. And so that's why we get that impression on the other side.
Oh. And so when you're teaching people about stories, that presence is just as important as the story you're telling. I mean,
It's one of the elements of story that's extremely important. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a hierarchy of what's more important than other things. There are certain things that need to be there in order to become a great storyteller. And, part of it is discovering the story, and part of it is knowing how to craft a story, and part of it is the telling. And in the telling piece, you have to be fully present. And that's why, especially in this world where we do so much online, I always say to people, if you're sitting there and your phone is off, or sorry, your camera is off, and you've got your Facebook open, or you've got a notebook here, or you're answering the phone, or you're doing a crossword puzzle while you're supposedly listening to this lecture or listening to this event, don't kid yourself. You're not being present, and that hour of presence will pay back tenfold, and an hour of so-called multitasking will result in you doing nothing and wasting an hour. So you've got to make a choice here. So I always say to people, like, the only exception to that perhaps might be podcasts, where when I do podcasts, I'm out walking my dog, I'm doing chores, that kind of stuff, because we can listen while we can do physical things. But presence is super important in how we show up to do anything in the world, for sure.
yeah, yeah. One last question, and then I'd love to hear what you're up to and how people can work with you. What's a storytelling rule that people often do but should actually break?
Oh, that's a really good question. What do they do, but they should break? A
It
rule
feels
that
like
they
a
do, but they should
rule, like,
break.
oh, you should do this, but then people should actually not do that. And it could even be around this
Oh,
presence thing, the
well, actually, I
dynamicism.
mean, so I actually have a very good rule that people do that they should break, which is people, a lot of people say, yes, you have to have a story and you have to tell your story and you have to tell your story in lots of different ways and so on, all of which is true. There are times where the role of storytelling is actually to be a story listener and not a storyteller. And especially when you're working with clients, there are times that you can tell them stories. There are times in the sales process that you want to be telling stories, but you need to be story listening, because when you listen to somebody's story, you can match them with something that's going to be super connecting and super persuasive. If you're not listening, then a big chunk of storytelling is not happening. That was the lesson. I'll tell you very quickly. I remember I've done a lot of work with master storytellers all over the world, and there's this wonderful storyteller from Canada called Dan Yashinsky, and he was visiting. And after the performance, I met him in a coffee shop, and we sat and chatted. And he said to me, what are the two things that what are the two skills every storyteller must have? And I thought he was going to say, a resounding voice or a great memory or something like that. And he said, well, the first one is you have to have strong arms, because you have to lift the chairs so you can put them into a circle so everybody can sit around a circle and listen to the story. That was the first thing he said, which I thought was really cute. And then he said, and the second one is you have to make a good cup of tea. And I was like, you have to make a good cup of tea? He said, you have to be able to make a good cup of tea because you need to bring it to the old woman who has the best stories, and then you can really hear them. I just thought that was wonderful. But what it brought home for me was this idea that it's not just about being the storyteller. It's not just about being the person who tells a story. It's about being able to truly listen to other people's stories, because that's where that connection happens. You hear their story, you tell your story, and then something happens that integrates the two, and then suddenly all kinds of magic happens. That's really where the magic is.
It makes so much sense. Something I've noticed recently, having coached people, for this past 10 years and taking a break and then coming back to it, I noticed that I have a tendency to listen and then reflect back to people.
Mhm.
And I don't remember doing it in this way in the past, but it's a slower, more methodical way. But what you're bringing to my attention in this conversation is I'm actually telling people their story back in
Mhm.
reflection. And that seems to have a bigger impact than me talking about my own story or telling them what to do or offering suggestions. Just that reflection back. Do I have this right? This is what I'm hearing. Can you fill in the parts that I might not be understanding? And then I tell them their story, and all these amazing things happen, which
Yeah.
is, I think, so beautiful.
No, it's so true, because sometimes we're in a bit of an echo chamber. We tell a story, but we don't hear our story. And we never hear the other person's story because we're too busy listening to our thoughts about their story. So like sometimes there's just is a bit of an echo chamber, and where we can add more listening, it's always going to be more useful. And when it comes to story, there's this unbreakable triangle between the storyteller, the story listener, and the story itself, all of which change. When one changes, they all change. And so we have to really be conscious of that. And a big part of how that evolves is through listening and telling, and telling and listening. Yeah.
So beautiful. What's the next step for people who are interested in learning more about you and how you help people with storytelling?
Sure. So I've just published a new book called Seven Stories That Sell, for people who are looking for selling, which is really exciting. I'm very, very happy about that. I also have a previous book called The Story Advantage, which came out a couple of years ago. Either of those books is a great way into the work. And I'm at story-coach.com, so you can always come on there and find all kinds of interesting things. And then social media is pretty much Story Coach wherever you go. But I think starting with either one of those books is a great place to start. And of course, on the website.
Thank you, Leisa, so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Shall I end with a little story?
Beautiful.
So I'm going to tell the story because and you may have heard it actually, because I tell this story quite a lot, but it just seems so pertinent in this day and age when there seems to be so much unrest in the world, you know. So there was a king who was fascinated by the idea of peace. And he wanted to, of course, as kings do, he wanted to own a piece of peace. So he asked that someone would paint the perfect picture of peace. And he sent out a message to the whole kingdom and said, everybody should paint pictures of peace and bring them to the castle, and I'll take a look. And the person who paints the perfect picture of peace, well, I will give them a great reward. And so many people created a picture of peace and brought it to the castle, and the king spent days deliberating, going through all of these different paintings and pictures and all kinds of things that people had brought. And finally, he was down to the last two. Now, the first picture, it was of a beautiful lake, calm lake, that was surrounded by mountains that were lush and green, and above the mountains was a beautiful blue sky, clear blue sky, with just a few puffy white clouds. And anybody who looked at this picture, you know, the mountains were actually mirrored in the lake. It was just so peaceful. Everybody who looked at it felt like it was the perfect picture of peace. But then there was the second painting, and this painting also had mountains, but these mountains were rugged and bare. And the painting had water, but it was a crashing waterfall that came down the side of the mountain, and there was lightning and there was rain and it was dark and it was a huge, big, stormy picture. But when the king looked closely, in the waterfall, right behind the waterfall, there was a rock. And on the rock, there was a bush. And under the bush was a mother bird sitting on her nest. And she looked like she was perfectly peaceful. And so he deliberated between the two. And finally, he chose the second painting because he said, peace is not when everything is perfect and there's all quiet and everything is beautiful around us. Peace is when there's a great storm, when there are bad things happening, when there are terrible things happening, and yet amongst all of that, there is peace in your heart. That is the true essence of peace, and that was the painting that he chose. And so in these moments where life can be a big storm for many of us, I just send that message that we can all find peace in our hearts amidst the noise, amidst the rain and the thunder and the lightning, and we can find our place of peace.
Yes, here. We all want to remind ourselves of that on a regular basis, that we can find it and have a practice, have something for generating peace in your life. Thank you so much, Leisa.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.